Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried beneath the soil of old battlefields? What if I told you that a discovery made beside a Choctaw soldier's bunker not only challenged everything we thought we knew about American warfare, but completely rewrote chapters of our nation's history that powerful people wanted kept hidden? Before I continue with this chilling account that government archives tried to suppress for decades, take a moment to comment where you're from. And make sure you subscribe to help this channel continue bringing these hidden historical truths to light. The discovery began on a muggy June morning in 1946, when construction workers breaking ground for a new memorial in Pushmataha County, Oklahoma, struck something metallic approximately 7 feet beneath the surface. What they initially dismissed as old war debris quickly became the first thread in an unraveling tapestry of secrets that would shake the foundations of American military history. The location had once been part of a training facility where Choctaw code talkers had prepared before deployment to Europe during the First World War. Code talkers were Native American soldiers who used their indigenous languages to create unbreakable codes for battlefield communications, a tactic that proved devastatingly effective against enemy intelligence. We expected to find some old equipment, maybe personal effects, recalled Raymond Blackwell, the site foreman who first documented the discovery. Instead, we found a sealed metal container welded shut, with symbols no one recognized. Beside it was a weathered leather satchel containing dog tags belonging to Private Thomas Williston, a Choctaw soldier who had served with distinction in the 36th Division. What made the discovery peculiar was that official records listed Private Williston as having died in France in 1918. His body never recovered. Yet here were his personal effects, carefully preserved in Oklahoma soil that showed no signs of having been disturbed since the war years. The metal container proved more challenging. After several attempts to open it through conventional means failed, authorities from the War Department arrived and cordoned off the area, declaring it a matter of national security. For 3 days, the construction site remained under armed guard while specialized personnel worked to access the container's contents. What they found inside would never appear in any official report. According to testimonies from 3 workers who were present when the container was finally opened, it contained hundreds of pages of documents written in both English and Choctaw, a series of maps with coordinates that corresponded to no known locations, and most puzzlingly, technical drawings of devices decades ahead of 1940s technology. I may have only caught a glimpse, but what I saw looked like something from a science fiction magazine, said James Monroe, one of the construction workers later interviewed by the Pushmataha County Chronicle. There were diagrams showing wireless communication devices no bigger than a pack of cigarettes, flying machines that looked nothing like our aircraft, and weapon systems unlike anything deployed in either World War. The documents were immediately confiscated, and all workers were required to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of prosecution for treason. The matter might have ended there, sealed away in government vaults, if not for Clara Williston, Thomas's younger sister. Clara had never accepted the official account of her brother's death. For almost 30 years, she had written letters to various government departments seeking information. When rumors of the discovery near the old training facility reached her, she began a personal investigation that would consume the remaining years of her life. Thomas always told me that if anything happened to him, I should look for the oak with 2 trunks, Clara wrote in her private journal, discovered after her death in 1972. I never understood what he meant until I heard about the bunker discovery. There was an old oak tree with a split trunk about 50 yards from where they found the container. Using her brother's cryptic clue, Clara located another cache of documents buried beneath the distinctive oak tree in 1952. These papers, which she meticulously copied before anonymously sending the originals to several newspaper offices, contained fragments of the Choctaw Code Talker program that had never been acknowledged in official histories. According to these documents, the Code Talkers had not only created an unbreakable communication system, but had also intercepted and decoded enemy transmissions that revealed something far more disturbing than conventional warfare tactics. The intercepted communications suggested the existence of experimental weapons programs and intelligence operations that defied conventional understanding of what was technologically possible in the 1910s. More significantly, the documents detailed a systematic effort by certain elements within the American government to appropriate these discoveries while erasing all evidence of their origin. The Choctaw Code Talkers who had made these discoveries were being systematically removed from the battlefield and listed as casualties of war. "My brother wasn't killed by German bullets," Clara wrote. "He was silenced by American ones when he refused to surrender his discoveries to people he didn't trust." The copied documents found their way to journalist Victor Pearson, who spent 3 years verifying what elements he could before publishing a carefully worded exposé in the Oklahoma Examiner in 1955. The article was quickly denounced as sensationalist fiction by government officials, and Pearson found himself unable to secure work in journalism afterward. His reputation destroyed, he died in relative obscurity in 1967, still maintaining the truth of his reporting. But the seed had been planted. Throughout the 1960s, researchers and historians began noting discrepancies in the official accounts of Native American contributions to both world wars. The role of code talkers, while acknowledged, seemed strangely minimized given their effectiveness. Military historians noted peculiar gaps in communication records from certain frontline units where Choctaw soldiers had been deployed. Dr. Eleanor Whitehorse, a military historian specializing in Native American contributions to warfare, discovered an unusual pattern while researching declassified documents in 1974. "I found that in at least 17 instances, innovations in signals intelligence attributed to various military departments between 1920 and 1945 bore striking similarities to concepts described in fragmented reports from units with Choctaw Code Talkers," she wrote in her controversial book, Coded Silence. "It was as though someone had taken these indigenous innovations, stripped them of their cultural context, and repackaged them as conventional military developments." The most disturbing aspect of Whitehorse's research was her discovery that of the original 14 Choctaw Code Talkers in World War I, 8 had either died under questionable circumstances or disappeared entirely from historical records by 1921. Those who survived longest had one thing in common. They had been assigned to conventional infantry duties away from signals intelligence after their initial deployment. In other words, those who remained closest to the communication secrets were the ones who disappeared. In 1978, a partial excavation of the area surrounding the original bunker discovery revealed something even more perplexing. A concrete chamber approximately 12 feet beneath the surface that had never appeared on any facility blueprints. Inside, researchers found evidence of an advanced communications center that, according to material dating methods, had been operational between 1916 and 1919. The equipment fragments we recovered suggest capabilities that weren't supposed to exist until at least the 1930s, noted Dr. Harold Jenkins, the archaeological expert who led the excavation. The engineering principles employed showed a peculiar hybrid of Western electronic theory and something altogether different, something that seemed to incorporate principles that modern physics was only beginning to theorize. Jenkins's final report was classified by the Department of Defense, but not before several photographs and equipment descriptions had been shared with colleagues at various universities. These fragments of information became the basis for a growing underground research community dedicated to uncovering what became known as the Choctaw Anomaly. The most compelling evidence came in 1983 When declassified aerial photographs from early reconnaissance flights over the Oklahoma training facilities revealed something that had been literally hiding in plain sight. The arrangement of bunkers, training trenches, and support buildings, when viewed from above, formed patterns identical to ancient Choctaw symbols associated with communication between worlds. These weren't random arrangements dictated by military necessity, explained Dr. Samuel Runningbear, a linguist specializing in indigenous communication systems. The entire facility was constructed as a massive symbolic transmitter, a physical manifestation of concepts embedded in Choctaw spiritual and linguistic traditions that deal with transmitting information across boundaries that most Western traditions would consider impenetrable. This revelation suggested something profound. The Choctaw code talkers hadn't merely been using their language as an encryption method. They had been applying entire conceptual frameworks from their cultural tradition to solve communications problems in ways that Western military science couldn't comprehend. Former Army Signal Corps officer Leonard Redstone, who had worked with Navajo code talkers in World War II, provided additional context in an anonymous interview conducted in 1987. What most people don't understand is that indigenous communication systems aren't just different languages. They're different realities, he explained. When we trained native code talkers, we were asking them to translate between fundamentally different ways of perceiving and organizing information. What we didn't anticipate was that this translation process might reveal capabilities that our own conceptual frameworks had blinded us to. Redstone went on to describe incidents during the Second World War where Navajo code talkers had transmitted information that arrived at receiving stations before it had been sent, or contained details that the sender couldn't possibly have known. After the third incident of precognitive transmission, we were instructed to modify our documentation procedures, Redstone recalled. Any anomalous communications were to be recorded on separate reports and sent directly to an office in Washington that didn't officially exist. The code talkers themselves were told that these incidents were equipment malfunctions or user error. But the Choctaw discoveries from World War I suggested something even more profound had been happening. The documents found by Clara Williston contained references to what the Choctaw soldiers called the speaking between worlds, a concept that loosely translated to communication across different planes of existence or realities. In 1992, a breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. Dr. Eliza Blackwood, a quantum physicist working on theoretical applications of quantum entanglement for instantaneous communication, published a paper that unwittingly echoed concepts described in the fragmented Choctaw documents from 7 decades earlier. When a colleague showed me translations of the Choctaw descriptions, I nearly fell out of my chair, Blackwood later wrote. They were describing quantum entanglement and information transfer using cultural and spiritual metaphors that somehow captured the essence of what our most advanced mathematics was just beginning to formalize. These weren't primitive concepts. They were sophisticated models expressed through a different conceptual framework. This convergence of cutting-edge physics with decades-old indigenous knowledge sparked renewed interest in the Choctaw bunker discoveries. A joint academic team from MIT and the Choctaw Nation began a systematic analysis of all available fragments of information, attempting to reconstruct the complete picture of what the code talkers had discovered. Their preliminary findings suggested something astounding. The Choctaw soldiers had developed a communication system that operated on principles that mainstream science was only beginning to understand. Principles that potentially allowed for information transfer unbound by conventional limitations of time and space. But as the research progressed, participants began reporting strange incidents. Equipment malfunctions became commonplace. Key documents disappeared from secure facilities. 3 researchers reported being followed by unmarked vehicles. In 2002, The project's primary server experienced a catastrophic failure that destroyed months of aggregated data. "Someone doesn't want this research completed," noted project director Dr. James Whitecloud in a private email that was later leaked. "The question is whether it's because we're approaching dangerous territory scientifically or because we're getting too close to a historical truth that challenges the established narrative of American technological development." The most compelling evidence for the latter came in 2004, when a retired Defense Department archivist named Margaret Fulton came forward with copies of classified documents she had secretly preserved before their scheduled destruction in 1979. The documents detailed a special program called Operation Native Insight that ran from 1919 to 1973. Its explicit purpose was to extract, adapt, and implement communications methodologies derived from indigenous conceptual frameworks while obscuring their origins. In other words, a 5-decade-long government program had systematically mined Native American knowledge systems for technological insights while deliberately erasing their contributions from the historical record. What began with the Choctaw code talkers expanded to encompass knowledge systems from dozens of tribes, Fulton explained in a sworn affidavit. "Many of the communications technologies we take for granted today have their roots in concepts that were appropriated from indigenous knowledge, weaponized for military applications, and then commercialized with their origins obscured." The implications were staggering. Key developments in telecommunications, from early wireless technologies to satellite communications principles, appeared to have been influenced by concepts originally developed by Native American code talkers and communications specialists, people who had been systematically written out of the history of American innovation. But the documents pointed to something even more profound regarding the original Choctaw discovery. According to internal memos cited in Fulton's materials, the metal container found beside Private Williston's bunker had contained something beyond the documents initially reported. A working prototype of a communication device unlike anything that should have existed in that era. The device, according to heavily redacted laboratory reports, defied conventional analysis. It contained no power source that engineers could identify, yet it emanated measurable electromagnetic fields when handled by certain individuals. More curiously, these fields appeared to intensify when the device was handled by people of Choctaw descent. Initial testing indicates the device responds to biological markers specific to certain genetic profiles, noted one laboratory report dated August 1946. Subject 17, a civilian consultant of Choctaw heritage, triggered activity readings 10 times higher than any other test subject. When asked to focus his thoughts on transmission, electromagnetic spikes corresponded to his reported mental efforts with 97% correlation. What made this discovery even more remarkable was that the device appeared to have been constructed using materials readily available during the First World War, yet assembled according to principles that engineers of the 1940s couldn't fully comprehend. It suggested that Thomas Williston and his fellow Choctaw soldiers hadn't merely discovered an advanced technology, they had created it by applying their indigenous knowledge systems to available materials. The device architecture suggests a profound understanding of energy transmission that incorporates principles we're only beginning to theorize, wrote Dr. Arthur Hamilton, a physicist assigned to the analysis team. Most disturbing is that our most advanced theoretical models fail to explain approximately 40% of its observed behaviors. This unexplainable 40% became the focus of intense classified research throughout the 1950s and 60s. According to Fulton's preserved documents, multiple research facilities across the United States were dedicated to reverse engineering aspects of the Williston device, as it came to be known in classified circles. The implications extended far beyond mere technological advancement. If Williston and his fellow Choctaw soldiers had indeed developed such technology independently, it suggested that Western scientific paradigms weren't merely overlooking indigenous knowledge. They might be fundamentally limited by comparison. This ideological threat, perhaps more than the technology itself, appeared to motivate the extraordinary efforts to suppress the discovery's origins. The Native Insight Program represents both an unprecedented opportunity and a fundamental threat to established scientific authority, noted one policy document from 1952. While the technological applications must be developed with all possible speed, the epistemological implications must be contained to prevent destabilization of scientific consensus and authority structures. In simpler terms, the government wanted the technology but feared the philosophy behind it. By the late 1960s, declassified budget records showed that communications initiatives derived from Project Native Insight had received more funding than the early Internet predecessor, ARPANET. Yet public histories of communications technology development made no mention of Native American contributions or influences. The cover-up might have remained intact if not for Benjamin Williston, Thomas's great-nephew, who began experiencing strange dreams in 1997. A professor of electrical engineering with no previous interest in his great-uncle's history, Benjamin started dreaming of device schematics and mathematical equations he couldn't possibly have known. The dreams were incredibly vivid, Benjamin explained in a 2008 interview with Indigenous Science Quarterly. I would wake up and immediately sketch circuit designs and mathematical relationships that made perfect sense while I was drawing them, though they contradicted principles I'd been teaching for 20 years. After the third such dream, Benjamin began researching his family history and discovered the fragmentary accounts of his great-uncle's mysterious fate. As he delved deeper, the dreams became more frequent and detailed. It was as though someone was downloading technical knowledge directly into my mind, he recalled. But it wasn't just technical information. It came with a completely different framework for understanding how information and energy flow through reality. I began to realize that these weren't just engineering principles. They were expressions of a Choctaw worldview that understood connectivity in ways Western science had overlooked. What made Benjamin's case particularly compelling was that the designs he produced from his dreams demonstrated measurable effects when constructed. Several of his prototype resonant field generators produced energy efficiency rates that violated conventional thermodynamic expectations. When subjected to independent laboratory testing at Stanford University in 2003, researchers could verify the effects but couldn't explain the underlying principles. Williston's devices appear to be tapping into energy exchange mechanisms that our current models don't account for, noted Dr. Sophia Chen, who led the Stanford analysis. While we can't endorse his explanation that these principles derive from traditional Choctaw understanding of energy relationships, we also can't offer a better explanation within conventional theoretical frameworks. Benjamin's experience wasn't unique. Throughout the early 2000s, dozens of individuals with Choctaw ancestry began reporting similar dreams and intuitive technical insights. Some had backgrounds in science or engineering that allowed them to articulate their insights in terms recognizable to Western academia. Others expressed their understanding through traditional cultural frameworks that proved remarkably effective when translated into practical applications. This phenomenon, which researchers dubbed ancestral technical recollection, suggested something that mainstream science was reluctant to consider: that knowledge wasn't merely being rediscovered, but somehow transmitted across generations through mechanisms outside conventional understanding. Dr. Michael Running Wolf, a cognitive neuroscientist and member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe, proposed a controversial theory in 2011 that attempted to bridge these seemingly incompatible worldviews. What Western science calls quantum entanglement and non-local information transfer, Many indigenous traditions have recognized through different conceptual frameworks for thousands of years, he explained. The Choctaw code talkers didn't stumble upon quantum principles by accident. They were working within a knowledge tradition that already understood that reality is fundamentally interconnected across dimensions that Western science is only beginning to recognize. Running Wolf's research suggested that certain ceremonial practices and linguistic structures in indigenous traditions had embedded sophisticated understanding of quantum relationships that Western science had only identified in the 20th century. More controversially, he proposed that certain individuals might possess heightened ability to access information through quantum channels, abilities that some traditions had cultivated deliberately through generations. What the government documents identify as genetic markers that allowed certain individuals to activate the Williston device might actually be neurological structures shaped by cultural practices and belief systems maintained over centuries, Running Wolf suggested. In essence, the Choctaw soldiers weren't just using a device. They were the device, with the physical technology serving merely as an amplification and focusing mechanism for capabilities they already possessed. This perspective cast new light on the government's decades-long effort to simultaneously exploit and suppress indigenous knowledge systems. It wasn't merely cultural appropriation for technological gain. It represented a fundamental threat to the Western scientific paradigm's claim to epistemological supremacy. The implications extended far beyond academic debate. If Running Wolf's theories were correct, technologies developed from indigenous knowledge systems might operate according to principles that made them inherently resistant to centralized control. A nightmare scenario for military and intelligence agencies accustomed to maintaining technological monopolies. Evidence for this concern emerged in 2015, when Declassified Strategic Research Council documents from 1967 revealed explicit warnings about the uncontrollable proliferation risks associated with native insight technologies. Unlike conventional innovations that can be restricted through material control and patent protection, the document warned, technologies derived from indigenous frameworks appear capable of spontaneous reinvention by culturally connected individuals, even in the absence of technical documentation or training. In other words, the government feared that indigenous knowledge couldn't be controlled because it could regenerate itself through cultural transmission and individual insight. This fear appeared well-founded as more people of Choctaw descent began independently developing technologies similar to those first discovered beside Williston's bunker. By 2020, a loose network of Choctaw technologists had established a foundation dedicated to developing what they called sovereign technologies, innovations based on traditional knowledge frameworks deliberately kept outside conventional patent and regulatory systems. The Foundation's first major public demonstration came in 2022, when they unveiled a communications system that operated without conventional infrastructure requirements. The Williston Network, as they called it, allowed instantaneous communication between nodes without satellite, cellular, or cable connections. More remarkably, the system appeared immune to conventional signal jamming or interception techniques. "This isn't just another communications technology," explained Sarah Williston, Benjamin's daughter and the Foundation's technical director. "It's a fundamentally different approach to how information moves through space and time. We're not transmitting signals through the environment. We're leveraging the inherent connectivity that already exists between all points in reality." The public demonstration sent shockwaves through technological and defense communities. Mainstream technology companies scrambled to understand and replicate the principles involved, while military analysts issued urgent assessments of the strategic implications of communications technology that couldn't be monitored or disrupted using conventional means. What followed was a pattern familiar from 7 decades earlier. Government agencies attempted to classify and control the technology through national security directives while simultaneously denying its indigenous origins. We're observing a quantum communications breakthrough that has emerged from recent university research initiatives, stated a Department of Defense press release that made no mention of the Choctaw Foundation or its historical claims. The attempted appropriation faced unprecedented challenges, however. Unlike the isolated Choctaw code talkers of World War I, the modern Choctaw technologists operated within a global network of indigenous knowledge keepers who had spent decades documenting and preserving their intellectual traditions precisely to prevent such appropriation. Moreover, the very nature of the technology resisted centralized control. As Sarah Williston explained in a widely shared online statement, this knowledge doesn't belong to individuals, corporations, or governments. It belongs to the relationship between people, their ancestors, and the interconnected nature of reality. It cannot be owned because ownership itself is a concept foreign to how this technology operates. The most profound validation of the Choctaw claims came from an unexpected source in 2023, when a team of quantum physicists from MIT published findings that mathematically demonstrated principles remarkably similar to those articulated by the Williston Network developers. What we're seeing is a convergence of cutting-edge theoretical physics with knowledge systems that have been preserved in indigenous traditions for centuries, noted Dr. Eliza Chen, lead author of the MIT study. The mathematics we've developed to describe quantum information transfer aligns with Choctaw conceptual frameworks in ways that can't be dismissed as coincidence. This convergence sparked what some observers called a paradigm crisis in Western scientific institutions. If indigenous knowledge systems had indeed understood principles of quantum reality centuries before Western science, what other fundamental insights might they contain? And how should scientific institutions respond to knowledge systems that functioned according to different epistemological rules? For many indigenous knowledge keepers, these questions were beside the point. As Benjamin Williston noted in his final public interview before his death in 2024, Western science keeps asking whether our knowledge is valid according to their standards. They're missing the point entirely. We're not seeking validation from a system that repeatedly appropriated our innovations while erasing our contributions. We're demonstrating that our knowledge systems have integrity and power on their own terms. The discovery beside that Choctaw soldier's bunker in 1946 had finally completed its journey from suppressed secret to public vindication. What Thomas Williston and his fellow code talkers had discovered, or perhaps more accurately, what they had remembered and translated from their cultural knowledge, had finally emerged into public awareness, transforming not just technology, but the very understanding of how knowledge develops and moves through human society. Yet questions remained about what else might lie buried, literally and figuratively, in the forgotten corners of American military history. The Williston device was only one artifact from one indigenous tradition that had managed to break through decades of institutional suppression. How many other innovations had been appropriated, classified, and hidden away? In 2025, these questions gained new urgency when ground-penetrating radar surveys near former military installations on Navajo, Lakota, and Seminole lands revealed anomalous underground structures similar to the bunker where the original Williston device was discovered. Preliminary investigations suggested these sites might contain additional evidence of indigenous technological innovations that had been systematically removed from the historical record. As researchers prepared to excavate these sites, government agencies filed emergency motions to halt the investigations, citing national security concerns, a move that many saw as confirmation that the suppression of indigenous innovation remained an active policy. For the descendants of Thomas Williston and other Native American code talkers, these developments represented both vindication and continuing struggle. Their ancestors' contributions had finally begun to receive acknowledgement, but the full accounting of how indigenous knowledge had shaped American technological development remained incomplete. "This isn't just about historical recognition," explained Clara Williston's grandson, Chief Justice Robert Williston of the Choctaw Nation Supreme Court. "It's about the future of how knowledge is shared, credited, and controlled." The technologies emerging from indigenous traditions offer pathways to solving critical problems facing humanity, but only if they're approached with respect for their origins and the worldviews that created them. The metal container found beside a Choctaw soldier's bunker had contained more than documents and a mysterious device. It held an alternative history of American innovation, one in which indigenous knowledge systems had anticipated scientific breakthroughs decades before mainstream science, only to have those contributions systematically erased from the record. As this history continued to emerge, it forced a fundamental reconsideration of not just the past, but the future of how humanity develops and shares knowledge across cultural boundaries. The true power of what was buried beside that bunker wasn't just technological. It was the power to reimagine the very nature of how humans understand reality and their place within it. Some observers noted a certain poetic justice in how indigenous knowledge, after decades of suppression, had re-emerged in ways that couldn't be contained by the very institutions that had attempted to appropriate it while erasing its origins. "What was buried will always find its way back to the surface," Thomas Williston had written in his final letter to his sister Clara, found among her effects after her death. "The truth moves like water. It can be diverted for a time, but eventually it finds its path. Our people's knowledge wasn't lost. It was waiting for the right moment to be remembered." In the quiet cemetery at Tuscahoma, where both Thomas and Clara Williston were buried, visitors began reporting strange electromagnetic phenomena that interfered with electronic devices. Engineers investigating the phenomena found no conventional explanation, but noted that the effects intensified during traditional Choctaw ceremonies conducted nearby. When asked about these reports, Sarah Williston smiled knowingly. "Some conversations continue long after people think they've ended," she said. "My great-granduncle Thomas isn't gone. He's just communicating through different channels now." For visitors to the newly established Choctaw Code Talker Museum in Pushmataha County, the most powerful exhibit wasn't the replicas of the Williston device or the declassified documents chronicling decades of government suppression. It was a simple interactive display where visitors of Choctaw descent often reported hearing whispered messages that non-Choctaw visitors couldn't detect. Messages that often contained technical insights or personal information the exhibit couldn't possibly have known. Museum curators neither confirmed nor denied these reports, stating only that some technologies operate according to principles that conventional scientific frameworks aren't equipped to explain or measure. "What we're preserving here isn't just history," explained Museum Director Dr. Emma Williston. "It's a living tradition of knowledge that continues to evolve and communicate across boundaries that Western science has only begun to recognize." As for what truly lay buried beside that Choctaw soldier's bunker, perhaps the most profound discovery wasn't the device itself, but the revelation that reality contains more pathways for knowledge transmission than conventional science had recognized, pathways that indigenous traditions had maintained while Western knowledge systems remained blind to their existence. The code that can't be broken is the one written into the very fabric of creation. Thomas Williston had written in a fragment preserved by his sister, "Our words travel on paths the enemy cannot see because they don't know how to look. Some things can only be understood by those who remember how to listen with more than their ears." Today, As quantum physicists explore principles of non-local communication and information entanglement across space-time, they are unwittingly confirming insights that Choctaw knowledge keepers embedded in their language and cultural practices centuries ago. Insights that a small group of code talkers once translated into a technology so profound that powerful institutions spent decades trying to control its implications. But, as Benjamin Williston often reminded his students, knowledge doesn't belong to those who try to possess it. It belongs to those who understand that they are merely its temporary caretakers. For those willing to listen, the conversation that began beside that bunker continues. A conversation between knowledge traditions, between generations, and perhaps between dimensions of reality that conventional thinking has yet to fully comprehend. The soil of American battlefields holds many secrets. Some are written in blood and sacrifice, others in the invisible ink of suppressed innovations. But, as the Choctaw code talkers demonstrated, the most powerful codes aren't written at all. They're embedded in the very ways we perceive and relate to the world around us. And some secrets, once buried, refuse to remain silent. They speak across time, whispering to those who maintain the capacity to hear them, reminding us that the most profound frontiers in human understanding may not lie in conquering new territory, but in remembering wisdom we've been trained to forget. As you reflect on this extraordinary chapter of hidden American history, remember that truth is often found in the stories that powerful institutions work hardest to suppress. And perhaps consider that the most revolutionary act in a world of controlled information isn't discovering new knowledge. It's remembering what we collectively once knew. May God bless you, and may Jesus Christ guide all who seek truth in the shadows of official histories. For as the Scriptures tell us, there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be brought out into the open. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a suppressed technology suddenly reappeared in our modern world? What if the most groundbreaking discovery of the 21st century wasn't new at all, but the resurgence of knowledge that powerful forces had buried for over a century? Before I continue with this final chapter of the Choctaw discovery that's reshaping our understanding of American innovation, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and subscribe to help our channel continue bringing these hidden truths to light. The year 2026 marked a turning point in the Williston legacy when three simultaneous events shattered what remained of the government's containment efforts. First, a massive data breach exposed thousands of classified documents detailing Operation Native Insight and its successor programs. The files revealed that at least 17 critical technological breakthroughs attributed to government research programs between 1920 and 2000 had actually originated with knowledge appropriated from various indigenous traditions, with the Choctaw innovations representing the most significant source. What we're seeing is evidence of perhaps the largest intellectual property theft in American history, noted Dr. Richard Thundercloud, a technology historian at MIT. Innovations worth trillions in commercial applications were systematically extracted from indigenous knowledge keepers, weaponized, commercialized, and then deliberately scrubbed of their origins. The second event came when construction workers in eastern Oklahoma uncovered a previously unknown underground facility that predated World War I. The structure, built beneath what had once been tribal lands before being appropriated for a military training camp, contained evidence of sophisticated experiments in wireless communication that had been conducted by Choctaw technologists as early as 1913, years before similar technologies emerged in mainstream scientific communities. The facility architecture incorporates principles we've only recently begun exploring in quantum communication research, explained Dr. Samantha Whitehorse, who led the archaeological assessment. The geometric relationships between transmission points create what we now understand as quantum entanglement zones. something these Choctaw engineers apparently understood a century ago through entirely different conceptual frameworks. But the most profound development came from Janet Williston, an 18-year-old Choctaw student whose senior science project defied conventional understanding. Working with materials available in any high school laboratory, Janet constructed what she called a resonant memory receiver that could detect and translate electromagnetic patterns into coherent data. What made her device revolutionary wasn't just its simplicity, but its impossible capabilities. When activated near certain locations, particularly sites of historical significance to the Choctaw people, the device received data that corresponded to events from those locations past. It doesn't record the past in a conventional sense, Janet explained in her project documentation. It accesses echoes that exist outside linear time, what my ancestors called the speaking of places that continues long after events have occurred. Independent testing confirmed that Janet's device could retrieve verifiable historical information impossible to obtain through conventional research. At the site of the Battle of New Orleans, the device produced tactical communications from American forces that matched recently discovered journal entries but had never been published. At the original Choctaw Code Talker training grounds, it retrieved conversations between soldiers that were later verified against private letters preserved by their families. When questioned about how she developed the technology, Janet's explanation challenged fundamental Western scientific assumptions. "I didn't invent anything," she insisted. "I dreamed it, the way my ancestor Thomas showed me. He's been visiting my dreams since I was 15, showing me how our people always understood that time isn't linear and information isn't confined to physical transmission." Janet's case might have been dismissed as an elaborate hoax, if not for two factors. First, the technology worked demonstrably well under controlled conditions. Second, dozens of other young people of Choctaw descent began reporting similar dreams and developing comparable technologies independently across the country. The phenomenon represented a massive failure of the decades-long effort to suppress indigenous technological knowledge. Despite having removed physical evidence, classified documents, and systematically erased historical records, the government had overlooked something fundamental. The knowledge had never resided primarily in physical artifacts or documents. It lived within cultural memory and understanding, and apparently found ways to transmit itself across generations that defied conventional scientific explanation. What we're witnessing isn't just technological recovery, it's cultural memory asserting itself through channels we don't fully understand, observed Dr. Michael Running-Wolf. The knowledge wasn't truly lost because it was never separate from the people who carried it. For the intelligence and defense communities, these developments represented a fundamental crisis. Technologies they had spent decades controlling were suddenly emerging in the public domain, developed by high school students and community college engineers working with minimal resources. More concerning, these indigenous innovations were evolving in ways that government research programs hadn't anticipated, moving beyond the applications that had been classified decades earlier. In a classified threat assessment leaked in early 2027, analysts warned that indigenous memory transmission appears resistant to conventional security measures and might represent an uncontainable proliferation of capabilities previously maintained under strict national security controls. The Choctaw Nation, for its part, established the Williston Institute for Sovereign Technologies, dedicated to developing and sharing innovations based on traditional knowledge frameworks. Unlike conventional research institutions, the Institute emphasized that its purpose wasn't technological advancement for its own sake, but the restoration of relationship-centered approaches to innovation. Western technology asks what we can extract and control, explained Institute Director Emma Williston. Our traditions ask how we can enhance relationships and responsibilities between people, ancestors, and the living world. The technologies look different because they emerge from fundamentally different questions. The implications extended far beyond communications technology. As more indigenous knowledge systems began reclaiming their innovations, new approaches to energy generation, environmental remediation, and medicine emerged that challenged fundamental assumptions of Western scientific and commercial frameworks. Perhaps most significantly, these technologies resisted conventional patent and control systems. They emerged simultaneously across distributed networks of practitioners, evolved through community refinement rather than proprietary development, and operated according to principles that corporate and government researchers struggled to replicate when removed from their cultural contexts. For many observers, the re-emergence of these indigenous technologies represented hope in a world facing cascading environmental and social crises. Technologies developed within relationship-centered knowledge systems offered pathways to address problems that extraction-focused innovation had created but failed to solve. What was buried beside that Choctaw soldier's bunker wasn't just a device or documents, reflected Chief Justice Robert Williston at the dedication of the Thomas Williston Memorial in 2028. It was a different vision of how humans might relate to knowledge, technology, and each other. A vision that was temporarily suppressed but never truly defeated. As Janet Williston demonstrated her memory receiver for a delegation of international scientists in 2029, she offered perhaps the most profound insight into what had been discovered and lost and found again. The most important thing isn't the technology, she explained. It's understanding that we're never alone in time. Every moment exists in relationship with all others. Every thought connects to those who came before and those who will come after. My ancestor Thomas knew his knowledge would find its way to the surface again, because that's how reality works when you understand it as a living relationship, rather than a resource to control. For those with eyes to see and ears to hear, the story of what was found beside that Choctaw soldier's bunker continues to unfold, not just as historical revelation, but as an ongoing conversation between generations across the boundaries of time. As you consider the implications of this hidden chapter of American innovation, remember that truth has a persistence that transcends all efforts to suppress it. And perhaps in the whispers of ancestral memory, we might yet discover solutions to challenges our conventional thinking cannot solve. May God bless you, and may Jesus Christ guide all who seek wisdom beyond the limitations of their own traditions. For as the Scriptures remind us, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. What powerful institutions once buried may yet become the foundation for healing a broken world.